Morning. These scripture readings today have a little bit of background just so that you, to get you into the middle of, they sort of come in the middle of a story. From Isaiah, our first reading, comes in the middle of a passage where Isaiah is talking about people and talking about the way in which they are worshiping and the way they are trying to get right with God. And so he talks to them and he says, well, think about that. You're coming and you're fasting for a day and bowing your head a little bit and maybe doing some sackcloth and ashes. But is God really impressed with that? And so he gives them this word. Is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see them naked, cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin. Then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your vindicator shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Passage from the Gospel of Luke today comes just after Jesus has started his ministry. He's gone out to some of the surrounding places. He's becoming a little bit famous, and he returns home to his home synagogue. And it's time to read the scriptures there. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. This is the word of the Lord.
People are people, and all people are the same in the sense of what they want and desire. There is a common humanity, and because of that common humanity, we have empathy. When we're going through difficult times, when there's pain, when there's suffering in our lives, when there's hunger, when there's deprivation, when there's humiliation, when there is joy, when there's celebration, we know what those things feel like, and when we see that happening in others, we can have some empathy or at least sympathy. So it's natural for us to want to help others. But how can we make sure that we're helping others in ways that doesn't hurt? And until we recognize our common humanity, the way that we continue to try to help others is going to cause hurt for them and hurt for us. And this is going to take some time to unpack. There is a wonderful book called How to Help Without Hurting. And there'll be a couple of quotes, and some of the themes, or most of the themes from today's message, I'm taking from that book. One of the questions that we have is, how do we, why should we care? Why do we care? And we heard Jean read these passages from Isaiah. Both, what is it that God most wants? The people thought that if they could just get the sacrifices right, and if they could just get the legal obligations right and the religious obligations right, then everything would go okay. But Isaiah was talking to the people of Israel, which basically God had put in time out in Babylon in exile, because they didn't do what God really, really wanted them to do, which was to take care of the poor, to care for and release the oppressed. And so that's what we have in the passage of Isaiah. In Luke passage, when we have Jesus talking and he's reading this passage from Isaiah, he's basically claiming this as his mission statement. This is why Jesus came, to proclaim good news, to free those that are in captivity, to reconcile and to set right the things that are wrong. Now, all of this, it has to do with how we view relationships. But specifically, I want to talk about, and the helping here is having to deal with poverty. Early on in the conversations when we were talking about the food pantry, and we're talking about immediately doing relief for those that are having food insecurity because of employment problems and everything else caused by the pandemic. Then in that process discovered there really was a need for an ongoing continuous food pantry here in Stewartstown because there was enough of insecurity in the community to warranty that. And almost all of the clients, all the people for the food pantry are coming from Stewartstown. So relocating or having it in another area doesn't make sense. This is the location. The vast majority of them are, half of the population of those 100 families that we are helping each month, half of them are senior citizens who just don't have adequate income to be able to make sure that they have enough of food. And the other half of it is primarily families with children, and the majority of them are employed. But despite being employed, they're not able to have enough money to, again, provide for their daily needs. They're having to make all kinds of trade-offs and all kinds of decisions. And the other thing we've kind of found about our community, I was talking to some of the people that were helping with the tax preparation through AARP, that they were really stunned as to how many people were coming in to have their taxes prepared as this free service whose income was so low they didn't have to pay income tax. So people are not getting by or are just getting by. And how can we who care about them help? We care about them because God cares about them. So one of the things we have to do is decide what is poverty. The wealthy, us, tend to see poverty as a lack of material possessions. I mean, let's be honest about how much stuff we have. We have so much stuff that we have storage places to put some of our stuff so we can make room for more stuff, right? And isn't it right after Christmas they have sales on containers and tubs and buckets and everything else so you can store your stuff to be able to do that. And some of the donation centers are inundated with stuff. There is so much clothing donated that they just don't know what to do with it. And they ship it overseas, and they don't know what to do with it. And it undermines, in some cases, the economy of the places where the clothing goes because the local manufacturers can't make a profit when there's so much free stuff coming from other countries. So we are very materialistic. We have a tendency to think in material terms. So if you define poverty as the lack of material possessions, that influences the way you think you should help. Poor people, when you ask us what is poverty, you talk about what people don't have. You talk about haves and have-nots. But if you go around the world and you interview poor people and you ask them what is poverty, you will almost always hear it in psychological and emotional kinds of terms. So things like shame, inferiority, powerlessness, humiliation, fear, hopelessness, depression, social isolation, and voicelessness. It's just being left out, of not having control or say in your life, of being lost and feeling just incredibly low self-esteem. So that poverty is more of a psychological and emotional thing than it is the absence of material possessions. Now, what causes poverty? So if we believe the poverty is caused by a lack of knowledge, then we will primarily try to educate. If we believe that it's caused by oppression by powerful people, then we will work for social justice. If we think it's caused by the personal sins of the poor, then we will respond by evangelizing and trying to disciple. If it is a lack of material resources, then we give material resources. And there is a place for that. And that's where the food pantry and other kinds of things come in. Because you have a situation where you need to provide relief. But there's a difference between relief and lasting help. Relief will, you've heard these phrases, you give somebody a fish and they can feed them for a day, you teach them to fish, or you give them a place where they can fish, or you develop the relationships that are needed, then you're feeding them for a lifetime. So there are many causes for poverty, but there is in that a need for relief. The problem is when all you do is relief. Because relief continuing is part of the broken relationship and ends up being part of the problem. And I'll explain that a little bit more. The real cause of poverty is broken relationships. And there are 4 fundamental broken relationships. And the first one is our broken relationship with God. I mean, that is the relationship that determines, that is the foundation for all of our other relationships. And it's the cause of sin and suffering. Actually, sin itself is brokenness, broken from God, being that gap, lack of reconciliation with God. It's sin that causes this. That sin is the reality of that broken relationship, which causes suffering. There's a broken relationship with ourselves, which causes a God complex or low self-esteem. And that's the kind of the relationship that gets into part of the brokenness, where we're hurt and they're hurt. So if we define the poor as them, those poor people, they're in such a need of help. And I'm deliberately standing high looking down at these poor people, and that we will come to their rescue and we will help them. That's kind of a God complex. It's like, we have what you need. We will provide for you. Or maybe little gods. Like, get it from God, give it to them. But placing ourselves in this kind of situation. So it makes us feel better. It makes us feel better. When you give away stuff, it makes you feel better about having a lot of stuff, right? And puts us in a situation where our sense of who we are is distorted. And our sense of who they are is distorted. So when you probably encountered this over and over again, people that are extremely wealthy who will believe that somehow the fact that they are wealthy is proof that they are superior to others. We do that in religious terms, don't we? That somehow material blessings are blessings. These are things that come from God. Well, what about people who don't have material blessings? Well, somehow God likes us better than them. And you see how the relationships are then broken. So not only is it hurting their self-esteem, it hurts our sense of self because we're thinking too highly of ourselves, or using them and helping them, those poor people, to feel better about ourselves. But then there are objects that we use to make ourselves feel better. So it is a broken relationship with self that causes that God complex or low self-esteem. And broken relationship with others, which causes our being self-centered. That it may sound strange when I said earlier, why should we care? The fact that, why would I even say that in a church? Because we're Christians. We're supposed to care. No, but do we really care? Do we give others thought? I mean, one of the things that Jesus is trying to teach us more than anything is stop thinking so much of yourself. And because the way that is the God's way is to always think of others and put others first. So when we have a broken relationship with others, we have a tendency to be self-centered. And they become objects to be exploited for whatever it is that we need ourselves. It's hard not to do that. I mean, that's part of our broken nature for children. I mean, that's even hard for parents with children. I parented my daughter because I love her. And I want to do a really, really good job. And I want everybody to think I'm such a great dad, And so it's kind of like, I put pretty flowers out there and oh, what a great garden. That looks really nice. You're a great gardener. Yes, thanks. Go me. I can do that with my daughter too. But that's using her to make me feel better or to enhance the way that people look at me in some kind of a way. So it happens. We exploit one another. It's part of our brokenness in relationships. And that's part of the brokenness with others. And finally, there's a broken relationship with the rest of creation, which is the cause of materialism and a loss of sense of purpose. Because the more the focus on things, the more we lose our soul and we lose our sense of purpose and who we are made in God's image. That what God really hopes for us, when the Jewish term shalom that is used for peace is much, much more than just peace or the absence of war. Shalom is wholeness, it's well-being, it's healthy and balanced in relationships. It's all of these broken pieces, when they work well together, that is shalom. When we're not abusing and destroying creation or exploiting it, when we're not abusing and destroying relationships and exploiting them, then that's shalom. That's the wholeness. That's the health. That's what God intends for us. Now, there are some secondary causes for poverty. There are lots of broken systems. But think about it. Systems are made up of people. If we're broken people, how can we make healthy systems? But the systems themselves need to be fixed. And systems, I think it's also one of those things that Paul is talking about when he says our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the powers and principalities in the higher places, that there's a level of abstraction that is part of the systems, where you can have people that are part of a system that is in itself corrupt and unjust, and participating in it unknowingly, but still guilty and needing to change those systems. So it's true of our political system, that the political system is really out of whack. The economic system is out of whack. The economic system worldwide is unsustainable the way that it is. And in order for everybody to be able to prosper, there has to be major shifts that are happening in the economic system because it's broken. Our social system is broken. We're asking police to do things that police should never have to deal with, and we're asking others to, it needs help on all different kinds of levels. The social system, one of the problems in the social system is people having no way of reconciling and working out the relationships and working out the problems without immediately suing somebody and engaging in the legal system. So if the only way we can interact with one another is doing it through the courts, that's broken. The way that we stratify the relationships in our society, that's broken. So the social system is broken. And finally, the religious system is broken. It just is. If we are all part of religious system or religious systems, and too much of what we do in those systems is completely unrelated to the gospel of Jesus Christ. So that's why the church has to go through a renewal time after time after time to get back to our roots, to get back to the real purpose of worship, to get back to the real calling of Christ in our lives, to dying to self to live for others. Now, so these are causes. Who are the poor? Every human being is poor. Until we understand that, it's not us and the poor, it's that we're all poor, because all of us suffer from those 4 broken relationships. And Jesus, they said that if you take the scriptures and you don't have the whole scriptures, then you hope you have the New Testament. If you don't have the New Testament, you hope you have the 4 Gospels. If you don't have the entire Gospels, at least you hope you have the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And if you don't have the Sermon on the Mount, hopefully you at least have the Beatitudes. And the very first Beatitude says, "Blessed are the, for they shall see God." The poor. Now, depending upon which of the Gospels you look at. Some literally say the poor in spirit, others just say, blessed are the poor. And so, okay, which is it? Is it like poverty of spirit, or is it lack of material things? And the true answer to that is yes. Because poverty comes from those broken relationships. So you may be lacking in material things because of the brokenness of the relationships and the brokenness of the spirit. It's all wrapped up together. So, who are them? Every human being is poor. All of us are in need of Christ's reconciling power to heal us in those 4 broken relationships. Now, we might be on different sides of those relationships, but all of us are poor. The second thing is that, and this is a quote from when healing, how to help without hurting, when healing hurts. Okay, is the book, and there's some quotes and the page number. Until we embrace our mutual brokenness, our work with low-income people is likely to do far more harm than good. Do you remember the war on poverty? Was there a winner? Because the foundational broken relationships were not addressed. The thought was that you could throw things at that. I remember doing mission project, and now I have a whole different, I'm rethinking mission projects of different kinds. But I remember being an Appalachian Service Project, and there were some projects there that had been done with the war on poverty, and local contractors had come in and blown insulation into walls that couldn't hold the weight, and so we were fixing the ceilings that were coming down because something had been thrown at it, and it's like, but the relationships were not being addressed. So until we recognize, until we embrace our brokenness, until we stop thinking that we need to go ride to the rescue of these poor people and realize there's a mutuality about relationships, then it will always be broken. Somebody shared the first service, they were talking about how a time in their life when they were really sick, and they were feeling guilty because their spouse had to take care of them. And a good friend of theirs who was a pastor said to them, he said, do you realize what a blessing it is for your spouse to be able to care for you in love? That you've heard me say before, it's one of those things like everybody says, I feel guilty if I need help. And he said, but you're depriving somebody of being able to do a really good thing. You know how good you feel when you help somebody else? So why would you deprive somebody else of the opportunity to feel good by helping you? But the difference is there's a mutuality there about that. If it's always us feeling good about helping somebody else, then this is not a two-way transaction. This is not a healed relationship. And so you see how the brokenness happens on both sides. We sometimes unintentionally reduce poor people to objects that we use to fulfill our own needs to accomplish something. There's some corporations out there that are really doing great things, but there's other parts of it where their giving of things to other places is just so that everybody feels good about them and goes and buys their products. And how many more people do we need that are stars to go for photo opportunities in other countries amongst poor people? So we can unintentionally end up hurting rather than truly helping. What is the solution? Yes, there is a solution. Poverty is rooted in broken relationships. So the solution to poverty is rooted in the power of Jesus' death and resurrection to put all things into right relationship again. The power of, just think about that. This answer to poverty is in the power of Jesus' death and resurrection. Jesus, God in the flesh, who just didn't stay up in heaven and hand things down to us, but came to live among us, to know our brokenness, and to, in his loving self-sacrifice, in his death and resurrection, create the path for us to be healed. So when you're at the cross, the ground is level. I'm at the cross. You're at the cross. We're both sinners. We're both in need of the salvation that only Christ can give. There's no one up, one down, or any room for self-esteem that's too big or too low, because Christ is the great leveler. So it's rooted in the power of Jesus' death and resurrection to put all things in right relationship again. You got 4 broken relationships. Jesus died to heal all 4 of those broken relationships. Poverty alleviation is the ministry of reconciliation, moving people closer to glorifying God by living in right relationship with God, with self, with others, and with the rest of creation. That at its heart, taking those broken relationships and reconciling them is what brings the healing, what brings the wholeness. And then in that, you have material poverty alleviation is working to reconcile the 4 foundational relationships so that people can fulfill their calling of glorifying God by working and supporting themselves and their families with the fruit of that work. That is shalom. Being able to, out of the dignity of your own work, of your own effort, to be able to express yourself, to be able to make a contribution to your community and your society, to be able to care for yourself and for your loved ones and for your family as you make a contribution to the society. Restoring people to a situation that is their rightful place to glorify God and live out that kind of life. That's how you alleviate poverty. So as we develop relationships with people, we begin to develop an understanding of where in their lives are those pieces missing. How can those relationships be healed? And then in that healing, there is the alleviation. Just a quick example. There was a person that was coming to a church that was constantly needing to receive groceries and needing to receive help. And instead of just giving, they sat down and said, tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us a little bit about your life. What do you like to do? What are you good at doing? And it came out that this person was a fabulous cook and just loved to cook. And they said, well, if you could, what would you do? She says, I would love to have my own business, my own little catering business. I've thought about it, and, with enough of family and friends and people that know my cooking and, other places, I could probably make enough of money to be able to make a living. And they said, so what's standing in your way? Well, money. So what this church and what this pastor began to do is hear story after story after story of this until their mantra began to be, stop helping people. So they decided to stop helping her and figured out that for about $1,500, she could start her own little catering business. So they gave her the $1,500 and then made an agreement with her that any activity or anything that was going on in the church that they need to have catered, they would give her the business. And she never had to come back for a handout of groceries ever again. And loved cooking for people, and her life was dramatically changed. Most of what's happening in a lot of places that are poor, that is really, really successful, is microloans helping people start their own small businesses. And so there were women, particularly women, but men and women, all over the globe starting their own little business. I remember hearing the stories from Pat and Janet and Joe and from others that went to Africa about, wasn't there somebody who had like a little pottery business? That's what it was, a little pottery business. And just, this was a grandmother taking care of her grandchildren because their mother had died of AIDS. But she was able to help pull things together because she was able to start this little business. Again, restoring dignity and respect. Now, that's a different way of looking at the world than what the world is teaching us about the way that economy should be, the way the finances are, that who the poor are, and why they're to blame for their own problems, and this and that and everything else. So through these coming Sundays, we're going to be looking at what do the scriptures say about the healing of these 4 broken relationships. And next week, I'm going to talk about when these worldviews collide, what happens then, and how can we be changed. So God, we pray that you would enable us to see ourselves and others as you see us, that we may be reconciled again to you. We will break it, but you will call us back to ourselves, to understanding truly who we are made in your image, to work, to enjoy life and work and productivity and giving and feeling like we are contributing, Lord, this life that you have given to us, to be healed with that, to be healed in our relationship with others, neither exploiting them or ignoring them. And finally, restoring our creation, Lord, with all creation. Because our materialism is destroying your creation, Lord. Accumulating, destroying, making, not properly distributing, all these things, Lord, that is broken. Come, Lord, be our great healer. Be our strengthener. Be our guide by the power of your Holy Spirit and the great truth and power of your death and resurrection to reconcile all back to you. Amen.